For number 22, we want to graph the polynomial, factor first if the expression is not in factored form. This one is already in factored form, so the best way to graph a polynomial is to find the zeros. The zeros occur by, or you can find the location of the zeros by setting each factor equal to 0. My first factor is negative 2x. So I'm going to set negative 2x factor equal to 0, and the solution to that is x equals 0. Then my other factor is x plus 2, which is repeated. We're going to set that factor equal to 0, and we get x equals negative 2. So what this does is it breaks up the number line at x equals 0 and at x equals negative 2. And we can pick test points within each of those three intervals to determine if the graph is above or below the line in those intervals. So I set up the interval table here, and the first interval would be from negative infinity all the way up to negative 2. I'm going to pick a test point anywhere in that interval, and then I'm going to pick a test point in the interval between negative 2 and 0. So negative 2 and 0. And then finally I'm going to pick a test point somewhere on the right side of the x equals 0. So that interval is from 0 to infinity. So I pick any point and evaluate the original function at that point. So a point that is in the first interval, that orange interval, could be x equals negative 3. And I evaluate the function at negative 3, f of negative 3, by plugging that into the original function. I get 6. So that's a positive value. That means the graph is going to be above the x-axis in that interval. So we can say above. Pick a test point in the next interval, some number between negative 2 and 0. I'm going to pick x equals negative 1, evaluate that test point, and I get f of negative 1 is 2. So that is a positive value. So that is going to be above the x-axis as well. Above. The graph, the y values are going to be above the y-axis in those two regions. And now we pick a test point to the right of 0, say x equals positive 1. And f of positive 1 is a negative 18. That's a negative, so the graph is going to be below the x-axis in that interval. So if I were graphing this by hand, I would know that the graph is going to touch the x-axis at negative 2. It's going to touch the x-axis at 0. The graph is going to be above the x-axis before it gets to negative 2. It's going to continue to be above the x-axis between negative 2 and 0, and then after it goes through 0, it's going to be below the x-axis. So the graph that looks the most like that is our graph A. We're going to do the similar technique for graphing number 23. So I'm going to shrink this down so we have, give me just a second here, just so we have space. Let's look at number 23. So to graph the polynomial again, it's already in factored form, so we're going to set each factor equal to 0. I set 2x squared equal to 0, x equals 0 is the solution for that. Set x plus 1 equal to 0, x equals negative 1, and x plus 2 equals 0, x equals negative 2. So what these zeros do, it divides my number line at 0, at negative 1, and at negative 2. So we have our table that we're going to set up to show the 4 intervals. We're going to have the interval from negative infinity to -2, from -2 to -1, from -1 to 0, and from 0 to infinity. So the first interval from from negative infinity to -2, the next interval from -2 to -1, the next interval from -1 to 0, and then that last interval from 0 to infinity. So I'm going to pick a test point in each one of those intervals. For example, in the first interval, I'm going to pick -3. So f of -3 is 36, which is positive. So that means the graph is going to be above the x-axis in that interval. Pick a test point between -1 and -2. I'm going to pick -1.5. And I get -1.125. It's negative. So that means the graph is going to be below the x-axis in that interval. Now I'm going to pick a number between -1 and 0, and I'll pick -0.5. And when you plug that in, you get 0.375, which is a positive. So that means the graph is going to be above the x-axis in that interval from -1 to 0. And finally, my last test point, somewhere between 0 and infinity, is going to be 1. And that number is 12, which is positive. So in that interval, the graph is going to be above the x-axis. So I know my graph is going to touch the x-axis at -2, at -1, as well as 0. Before it gets to -2, my graph is above the line, and then it's going to be below the x-axis between -2 and -1. Then it's going to be above, and then it's still going to be above. So that is my sketch of the graph. If you were doing this on a graphing calculator, you would probably need to adjust the scale so that you can see more detail of the graph. And that one looks most like choice D. So notice it's going through -2, -1, and 0. It's above the line, below the line, above and above.